Hey, good afternoon, family. Welcome to this September 6th edition of Smart Church at Noon. We appreciate everybody that's coming in. We are especially grateful for those of you who have been constant and consistent with us as we continue to press forward in the study of God's Word in the middle of the day. Good afternoon, all of you who are signifying in the chat box. We love you so much for letting us know not only that you are here, but participating in the teaching and learning process that we call Smart Church. Thank God for everyone who is tuning in for the first time. Consider yourself family. We welcome you into the space. You will notice that during this time, as I am facilitating conversation, people will chat about what is being said based on personal knowledge and experience, quoting scriptures for us, asking questions, responding to one another. That's how we get down in this space. We are all teachers and we are all learners right here in the virtual space that God has provided for us. And as always, shout out to our rebroadcast crew. We appreciate you all so very much for fitting the lesson in when your schedule permits. Thank you for doing what you do and for remaining attached, even though you can't fit the live broadcast in your schedule. You know how we do at this time. We come together to kind of walk through scripture and background, historical and social, so that we can understand what the text is saying to us. And then tonight at 7 o'clock, we will come back together to have a much more expanded conversation concerning our topic. I'd ask you now, with your sacred scriptures and your note-taking apparatus ready, join me in the book of Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 through 11 calls our attention. The book of Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 through 11. It will guide our conversation this afternoon. We will shift, if you will, in themes. Today's conversation is based on the theme, the power of the pause. The power of the pause or rest, or in the book of Hebrews in the Old Testament, they use the term Sabbath, which is actually pronounced Sabbat. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 through 11 is what calls our attention. Thank you for putting the text in our chat box for those who will watch this at a later time. I'm going to read from the New International Version. Reads this way: there remains, then, a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Verse 11. Let us, therefore, make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. That is the reading of God's holy and unchangeable word. The power of the pause, or the power of rest, or as I mentioned, according to the Old Testament and this book of Hebrews, the power of Sabbat. We say Sabbath in our tongue. So, and this comes from the notion, or what triggered these ideas, is that we are yet in the middle of, while at the same time trying to come out of a very trying time for most of us. Those years, 19, 20, 21, you can bring that up to today, took a lot out of us, and in so many cases, still taking a lot out of us physically, spiritually, uh, psychologically, emotionally. And the fact of the matter is, we are trying to make sense of the world now, the so called new normal. And we're tired. Many of us are tired. Sure, we keep it moving. Of course, we are doing what we can do, even though a lot of times our joints ache, or all of the things that happen with us and to us physically. But many of us uh, find ourselves in a condition that can only be described as exhausted, right? Because we are fighting against, as I said, the physical challenges, but there are also the intellectual and the psychological and emotional challenges that come along with the day. COVID 19 is always at the back of our minds, and all of the toll that it has taken on us. Financial issues, right, that are caused by the events of the since 2019, and on and on and on. We can give example after example, and so uh, I have a kind of a series of conversations that are connected, but maybe not yet connected. And so today, again, we'll start with simply, sometimes we have to just tell ourselves that we need to rest, and some of us don't have, especially with the noon crowd. And shout out to you for being so consistent, because right, remember we started this saying we're going to take a break from the evening and get back to it. And we've been live at noon for, man, a number of years now. But I know many of you are retired from official employment and doing some other things with your life. But and I know that you don't have to be in motion to make yourself exhausted or to exhaust your energies. So just thought we would walk through it. I am praying that these conversations help us as individuals, as families, and of course, as a community. So, the book of Hebrews, the power of rest, the power of Sabbath, or the power of the pause, because sometimes we just have to pause in our routines. Let's do some background work as we always do. The big book of Hebrews. We have not discovered the author. We don't know who she or he is. There's a lot of speculations about who the author is, but nobody's been able to, uh, definitively say this is the one that wrote to these people who are scattered across Asia Minor. But you've been reading the book of Hebrews for a while, so you know that this book is heavy on Old Testament references, and particularly the prophets. And so, whoever wrote to these people this book of encouragement um, wrote knowing that the recipients of this treatise have knowledge in uh, Judaism, in Old Testament. And so they were able to use these references to make their points. I want to read to you what Walter Massey says about this book. New Testament professor Walter Massey says Hebrews is a confessional writing sent to strengthen faith, inform the will, and renew hope of the impatient, questioning believers who need to continue. And then he quotes chapter 12, verse 2, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. That's Massey's explanation. This is a book of encouragement for people who were going through in our rhetoric, is what he says. Aubrey Hendricks, I think, is professor, again, New Testament professor Aubrey Hendricks, who wrote the book The Politics of Jesus in the early 2000s, was on it too when he described the book of the people who wore the title Hebrew. Um, that title may not have been so much about their ethics or their religion, but may have been more or less about their social standing, because the word Hebrew means outsiders. And so, when you look back at the history of these people up through what we have recorded in our New Testament, you know that Israel or the Hebrews always seem to be on the outside of some system or another. I think there is listed five, maybe six times that Israel found itself enslaved or in exile to some other people. And that's not new, because when we really zoning out, when we really in our walk with God, when God has you in those times when you are praying and you're fasting, and God is teaching or giving revelation to you as an individual, you feel like an outsider in many of the spaces where you have to operate. You're going to work and you're around people, but your mind is not really there. Or you go to the family function, the social or whatever it is. But in those times, you kind of really feeling like an outsider, because what's being said is not connecting and the conversations are not connecting with you. It's an outside type identity. I know that in this day and age, we don't live like that always, but there are times, right, when you are God, they use the young people's language, when you are God are vibing like that. And I know I have to be here, but I'd really rather be sitting still somewhere. Really rather be in my place of prayer, so I can commune with God like I want to. Don't look now, but that's kind of an outsider disposition. And so we can believe, I think, that this term Hebrews, outsider, really fits the history of the people of Israel. And I would suggest that every now and then you and I will find ourselves uh, feeling like outsiders. So those are the people to whom this particular letter is written to the outsiders, if you will. So let's check out what's happening with us. The centering theme of our paragraph 9 through 11 of chapter 4 is Sabbath, again, or rest. And thank you, Sister Beatrice, for putting that in the text. Pause, right? So what's happening with the people in the first century, these Hebrews, is that they are trying to really, in our terms, get themselves together. This is when the church is on the edge of persecution. Uh, Trajan and I forget his name, the other Roman emperor, are finding that it is politically expedient, beneficial to persecute, or to allow people to persecute the so-called Christians in that day. And so the people are attacked, their livelihood, and sometimes even their very lives are attacked, and the government is not trying to do anything to help them. That ought to sound familiar to us. And so they're dealing with persecution. That's why that passage of scripture we like in Hebrews, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together. In many cases, that's not so much about a spiritual reality as much as it is about literal protection from the physical enemies of the faith. Um, and so people are finding that their possessions are taken from them. Again, their lives, their physical well being is under attack. All of that is happening. And so you can imagine in their minds, they got to keep it moving. I have to always stay on my guard from Sunday morning. We talked about the power of staying woke. They were feeling like they had to stay woke. All of that is happening, and so the writer says, I understand your predicament, and certainly, yeah, so many events today. You're exactly right, Sister Ross. Um, and none can deny that the predicament of the believers, those who were moving from Judaism into Christianity in its very infancy, nobody can deny that that was a serious situation that garnered the complete attention of the people of God. But the writer says, in all of that, you're grinding yourself into the ground. You're not giving attention to your own well-being, and so that's why the writer calls the people back to something they knew, that God taught their ancestors all the way back to the people who came out of Egypt, that wandered in the wilderness, and God taught them in the book of Exodus how to rest. Sabbath day, they called it. And so the writer first points out for the people um, that just like God, you have to learn how to rest. I know that's rhetoric we've been hearing in our church, but this rest is really an act of obedience and deference to God. I'll say that for you again because I know some people take notes. When the writer calls their attention to Sabbath or to rest, the rest of God or God's rest, it is really a call to an act of obedience and deference to God. Simply put, when we rest, it is obedience to, if you're taking notes, Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 and 9. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 and 9. God giving Moses the Decalogue, what we call the Ten Commandments. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Then it says on the seventh, you got to rest. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 and 9. So that's obedient to the word. Quite often in our circles, uh, you know, we admonish one another and encourage one another to just live like the word says. When you're praying, pray what the word says. And so this is kind of a practicum, if you will. Don't just read it, do it. You have to pause after 6 days. Thank you, sir. You have to pause after 6 days. But in terms of deference, it is not just about doing what the scriptures say. Deference says, I'm going to let God have God's way. Now, that's a little bit different. Obedience says, I'm doing it because you said to do it. Much like Peter, right? Remember Peter and the guys fishing all night long, didn't catch anything. Jesus says, drop your nets. And Peter says, now we know what we're doing because this is what we do, right? We're fishermen. But because you said to do so, I'll do it. That's obedience. Which sometimes can be a dirty word in our society today. But deference says, I'm going to yield my way of doing things and do it your way, which is also difficult for us as individuals, right? And as it relates to our relationship with God, especially when God uses another human to deliver the word or to give the command or to give instructions. So we replace God's instructions and say that is, Johnson's instructions or Thomas's instructions, when they are really just relaying what God said to do, right? And so it is while it is hard for obedience is hard for us, when you add deference onto that, I'm gonna let you have your way, it becomes even more difficult, especially when God's way seems to go contrary to our priorities. And so if you're taking notes, how do we put this idea of rest or Sabbath into action for our lives? Let's move it farther than that, because we're going to get to the rest part at the end tonight. But we can say, I want to practice deference to God. Now that's going to require spending time with God, which we will get to a little bit later today in this conversation. But I don't think that practicing moving my priorities to the background and God's priorities to the foreground, I don't think that happens automatically. Just because you're saved doesn't mean it's going to trigger in your mind or spark in your mind right away. I think that has to be intentional action for us, right? In both intentional and deliberate, I would say, because you had to try. You got to push yourself to say, you know what, I'd really like, and I'm not trying to get in anybody's business, but I'd really like to, get myself a little drink and just kind of calm myself today. But I feel like God is calling me to turn the music off, turn the television off, and spend some time in quiet, in meditation, in conversation. That's prayer, in conversation with God. Now, that's a very churchy type example, but there are all types of examples. You can probably give me more about how sometimes what God is calling you to uh, contrary perhaps to what you had in mind or what you plan to do. So if you're taking notes, uh, um, let's make that one of our action steps from this lesson. Practice deference to God. That is, let God have God's way. Practice deference to God. Let's keep talking. Uh, what you see also is that there's a promise connected to this idea of obedience and deference. And we're framing this in rest. There's a promise connected. It's a rather long passage, but if you're taking notes, write down Isaiah 58:13 through 14. Promise connected to rest or obedience, deference. Isaiah chapter 58:13 through 14. I'll just read 14 for you. Then you shall delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. So that's kind of that example we use sometimes, jumping from mountaintop to mountaintop. God says, if you let me have my way, if you are obedient to what God says about rest, then the promise, God says He's going to keep you moving higher on the high hills of the earth and feed you the heritage, right, of your ancestors. In other words, all of the promises that God made to your ancestors, God will make it come true. In the church, we use the term manifest in your life. So imagine that. All of the things that your ancestors sacrificed for because they believed in you, God says He's going to make that stuff happen in your life if we learn how to rest, practice Sabbat. Pause is our term. If we learn how to pause the godly way. Next, when we talk about resting, it is godlike. It is to imitate God, to have, and this will sound like an oxymoron, but to have a regiment of rest, right? A specific time that you will pause. Thank you so much. A specific time that you will pause, um, in your day, not sporadically or not when you recognize, oh, I'm just tired. But when there's a set time for the pause or a set time for rest, then you're really acting like God. You call to your memory Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Those of you who are not paying attention, when you hear me say thank you, uh, the people are quoting our text or our scriptures in the chat box. If you're running behind and you want to go in there and look and write them down, that's what's happening. So yeah, Genesis chapter 2, 1 through 3. It talked about, everything that God created, all of the work that God used his imagination and his authority and his ability to do. All of God's work, it says that he did it in 6 days. And on the seventh day, God rested. That's Genesis 2, 1 through 3. Um, but let's think about this, the way that we have learned in this in this context, and let's build on what we have learned. We talk about God in 6 days. For us, our minds immediately go to 24 hours. So 24 hours, God worked. But think about it. God can't be bound by time, right? God is both in and out of time at the same time. In fact, God creates time for us. God gave us chronology, 24-hour days, 7 days a week and 30 to 31 days a month, and on, right? 365 days a year. All of that, that's for our sake. That's not for God's sake, because God can't be bound, limited by time. That's why what we think sometimes is such an emergency, uh, God understands that God is going to do God's thing uh, in God's timing, and it's going to be right. That's why your mama and them, our mama and them said things like that sounds silly when you consider the pressure of living in our societies, but they would say things like, he may not come when you want him, but he's always on time. And you thinking, I don't know so much about that. But when you consider that God is not bound by chronology, right, or chronos in the Greek, then you know that when God works, and is always, the timing is always impeccable. So God can't be bound by time. And since God can't be bound by time, to say 6 days is really for our benefit and not for God's benefit. And that 6 days may not have been 24-hour periods. I would even suggest, and I want to challenge your critical thinking now, that this notion of 6 days may be an indication of completion. God worked until God was finished, and then God rests. I don't have scholarship to back that up, but maybe you ought to think critically. We ought to think critically about that. Maybe the text is telling us that you don't rest until you finish. And we've all had to work with those people who frustrate us because every 10 minutes they're taking a rest, right? Every 10 minutes you look up, they're sitting down and you working. And so maybe part of the lesson there is we work until complete. That doesn't negate the need for our physical bodies to rest. That's not what I'm trying to prove or say. I am trying to say that maybe the model God gave us is, if you start it, you finish it. So I hope that we're still together. I'm not seeing much traffic. I'm not seeing much traffic in the chat box, and I know you guys are expert teachers, master teachers, because I've been sitting with you these years. I know what you are like. Let's keep it moving for the sake of our lunch period. Uh, the text says, there remains. There remains. Seems like such a simple phrase, except when you look at the language The Greek language, the original language, as I told you earlier in this conversation, this is really about correction. It is a word of correction. Thank you, Sister Ross. It's a word of correction because, as I said, the people were so busy trying to survive that they did not take the time to sit and let me stick a pin here and say that when we talk about pause, rest, it is more than just a time to take a nap. It's about sometimes sitting with each other. It's about meditating. It's about thinking on these things and sharing with one another. What we do here at noon and at 7 once a week, this is a pause, if you will, because we try to turn down the noise and sit together and think about scripture and certain themes and have these conversations to let iron sharpen iron. This is a pause. This is a rest, albeit, very short as we think about the chronological time. But so the pause is not just about you need to go take a nap or you need to take a vacation. It's about thinking on these things. It's about sometimes, I told you before, one of my favorite lines in a sitcom, asked the guy what he did, university professor, and he said, I thought about some things and I wrote some of them down. I know you busy. I know you have 17 things you need to do right now, but there are times that God designed for us that we have to just sit, right? Sit with yourself and sit and contemplate what the things that you have to do. Prioritize, right? Don't prioritize on the go unless the situation calls for you to do that. Sometimes priorities and projects and plans and all have to be set in the quietness and not so much on the go. And so that's what the writer that's what the writer is doing. I know you're trying to keep your head above water, but pause for a minute. Because again, what happens for many of us is we just wearing ourselves out, even in retirement, or even though you may be on a sabbatical from something, sabbatical rest, right? Sabbat, from something or someone. We still fill our minds and our days with things. There you go. Brother Lewis say, just shut everything down. We still fill our minds and our days with a list of things that we feel like we have to accomplish to feel like or to think that we are that we are pleasing God, that we're doing those things that make us look right in the world around us. I read an interesting article that was sent to me yesterday. You've been watching our local news. We're in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where there's a shortage of bus drivers. There's a shortage of nurses, and you can probably name some other occupations where we're not teachers, right? We're not doing right. We just don't have enough people. And fact is, two things are happening, and the social structure, those who are just trying to make money, get you back to the office, make money, let's keep it moving, right? They will say people are lazy, people don't work. But I would push back on that and ask you to think about in your quiet time. One is I think people are tired of being exploited. That is fleshed out by an economist named Robert Reich, right? I'm tired of giving blood, sweat, and tears, and you paying me the least amount that you can in order to get production out of me. People are tired of being exploited. And then, second, people are just tired, period. Sister Beatrice Ross says, if you prioritize on the go, it is a perfect situation for chaos. Oh, my. Well, you better read that again. Prioritizing on the go is the perfect situation for chaos. Wow. Sister Irma Jones, meditation will clean the clutter from your mind so you can think clearly. There it is. Think clearly, which is, ties to that chaos thing. Man, you guys are teaching. Sister Gwen Jones, even in our faith and service, rest can be as important as work. Yes, indeed. That's the point, Sister Gwen. That's what we're trying to drive home. Uh, See, I told you, pay attention to that chat box. That is so powerful. I'm going to sit with that one myself. Donald Lewis is also asking, in this rest, we have to consider, how are we treating people? What's our interaction like with one another? Excellent. Excellent. So we're talking about people are just tired. I listed all of those occupations. I read an article yesterday that was sent to me. And I knew this was happening, but the article really drove it home. Hey, what's up, Brother Joseph Collins? Thank you for being with us. Shout out to Brother Eddie Ross for inviting you. I hope, well, I'm sure that something is being said through that chat box that's blessing you. Yeah, believe it or not, there is what they are calling the the great resignation of pastors. Just like all of the other occupations that we've talked about, and you know them all, that also fits in the role, in the vocation of pastors. There's a lot of women and men walking away. And I know in our tradition, we think that once you are called to be a pastor, that's for life. Well, that's inherently not true. And I mean that from the root, that's not true. But the same thing, man, people are tired. And I'm not saying that taking an hour or 30 minutes a day is the panacea for it all, is just going to fix everything. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is we do need to take more time to pause, sit with one another, because this is not necessarily an individual thing, but also to be quiet with ourselves and with God, or to just be quiet and stare at the ceiling fan, whatever the case may be. So there remains, this is correction. You're doing a lot of things good, but it's something you are not doing correctly, and that is to rest. The rest, the pause, the Sabbat allows us to connect with God in ways that we cannot do on the go. And again, I know that our society teaches us, and we celebrate those people with 2 cell phones and got to have a driver because they have so much to do and they always on the go. And every time we look up, you here, you there. And once a month, no, and once a year, they'll take a vacation and admonish us and say, got to rest from it all. It's not just about that, right? That there needs to be regular intervals of rest for our lives, because it allows us, as I just said, to connect with God. It's not just about setting aside so that I can be replenished mind, body, and soul, like we do with food and water. It's about spending time with the one that we are made in God's image and God's likeness. I'll give you a very elementary example, but for me, it makes perfect sense. They bought my grandmother one of these electric um, self-propelling vacuum cleaner things with a little disc, and she allows it to go and doesn't have to stand over a vacuum cleaner. The thing cleans the room. I'm sure many of you probably have one. You know what she tells me though? Sometimes told me this morning, go and set my vacuum cleaner on the charger so that I can run it later. Man, that is so powerful for me, right? Let it rest. Let it get recharged, because there is more work to come. Go back to the thing Go back and connect with the thing that's going to give you the energy you will need to keep going. Many of us take naps, read a book, or watch our favorite television shows, but never go back and connect to the one that gives us the energy, the know how, the knowledge, the guidance we need to keep moving forward. Here's another one. And you've heard me say this before, and I wish I could put it in all caps for us to understand. It does not matter your network, your degrees, your position, your reputation. Nothing will beat spending time with God. You have to make that a priority. Nothing at all will measure up to and do for us, do for you with spending quiet, dead, other than spending quiet, dedicated time with God. Sister Gwen Jones, denying ourselves does not mean neglecting ourselves. You better say that again. Denying ourselves does not mean neglecting ourselves. There's the t-shirt right there. I like that one. Thank you. Brother Donald Lewis, when I go fishing, I leave my phone in the car. Just some time for me. There you go. And I can imagine in the midst of nature, there's some serious communing happening between you and the creator that all that you are experiencing. That's a great example. Here's the last thing I want to share. Verse 11 says, let us therefore be diligent in entering that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. Lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. When we ignore the call, the encouragement to rest, what we're really saying is we don't believe God. It's kind of heavy to end with, but it is the equivalent to sin. Put that in your notes because I want you to sit with that, ponder on that. When we ignore the call to rest, it says, I don't need you, God. I don't believe you. I can do this. And then that is, the equivalent to sin. I apologize for leaving us on such a heavy note, but do know that God does great things in our rest, and we'll come back tonight and talk it through. Sister Gwen Jones, spending quiet time with God can put everything else in perspective. Thank you, sis. That's how I should have ended it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Spending quiet time with God could put everything else in perspective. That's right on it. Thank you guys so much for being with us today. Brother Collins, again, thank you for making yourself known with us today, and all of our visitors. Thank you for being with us. We'll be back tonight at 7:00. So that's just kind of a walk through scripture is the way we handle noon. But at tonight at 7, we call it Smart Church Amplified because the conversation expands. Sister Charlene Anthony, after God made the world, he rested. Exactly. Imitate God. Do what God did. Yes, thank you. Ladies, this weekend is Women's Weekend. Tonight is choir rehearsal for the ladies, 7 p.m. sharp. Uh, please be here to lend us your voice for what promises to be a great uh, uh, worship experience this weekend. You guys are welcome. But remember, I always say, we together, we teaching one another. We're learning from one another. Thank you all. So don't forget the assessment, $100 per adult lady. We will look forward to women leading us this weekend. We're planning our annual Souls to the Polls. The date is September 30th. That's a Saturday. Southern will be in Arkansas, playing Arkansas Pine Bluff. So Saturday, September 30th is our day, first day of early voting. You know how we like to do. We go to the other side of town so we can show up in big numbers to let the dominant culture know that yes, we are here and yes, we are voting in your space. So you'll hear a little more information about that coming soon. We do plan to get a bus and want as many people as we can get to go on the bus with us. We're collaborating with prophetic voices, of course, but we've expanded and have a couple of more churches rolling with us. One of the sons of our house, Reverend Pastor Anthony Patterson, and the King Solomon Church, and also my pastor, Dr. W. Marshall Miles, and the New St. John Church joining Prophetic Voices as we have our annual Souls to Polls. You'll hear more about that. Then, lastly, the request from our member, Sister Kenyatta Coverson. She's trying to get grandparents to volunteer at Scotlandville High School with your presence and your wisdom and your know-how. I'm going to go ahead and put the telephone number in the chat box for us so that if you are interested, you can contact her at the school. Let's see. But I think it's noble and a wonderful idea to ask grandparents to come spend some time at the high school where she works, Scotlandville. There it is, 775 3715. Remember our sisters and brothers who are bereaved or um, not feeling their best, in bad health. Thank you, all of you. I love you. I'll see you this evening at I'll see you this evening at 7 o'clock.